In this video, I'll tell you exactly what inflation is all about, and we're starting right now. Hey guys, Elliot here. So if there's one word you heard way too much of in the last few years, it's got to be inflation. It spiked in the wake of the global pandemic, and most of the world's been fighting to get it under control ever since. But what exactly is inflation and what causes it? Well, the definition of inflation is very simple. It's the general increase in the price of goods and services over time. When there's inflation, it essentially means that you have decreased purchasing power and will be able to buy less goods with the same amount of money. Now, in order to quantify anything, you of course need a way to measure it, and the tool used to measure inflation is called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which I'll talk more about in a minute. Inflation also has a polar opposite called deflation, and that happens when prices decline over time and you can purchase more goods with the same amount of money. Now, inflation is generally thought of as being bad, and generally that's true. Excessive inflation makes everything expensive and lowers savings rate as people need to spend more money for basic goods. But if inflation is moderate, there are actually some positives, such as increased wage growth, increased investment, and greater profits for companies. Borrowers benefit as they can repay debts with money that has depreciated in worth, and lenders also benefit from an increased demand for credit. Deflation also comes with some positives, such as greater purchasing power for consumers, and it's actually a normal part of a healthy economy. But when excessive, it's got a dark side, and that has to do with higher unemployment and slowed economic growth and the general recession that can follow. Now, I mentioned the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, a minute ago. That metric is key to measuring inflation. The CPI is just a basket of selected essential goods and services that are used as a marker for the average price increases. There are over 200 such markers organized into 8 major groups. They are food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education and communication, and other goods and services. These are supposed to represent day-to-day expenditures for the typical American, and their average price increases are measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and together they make up the CPI calculation that is released by the BLS to economists and policymakers. CPI calculations are not perfect, but they are one of the best tools we have to measure inflation or deflation. So now that we covered what inflation is and how it's measured, the last question to ask is how inflation even happens and what can be done to bring it under control. Well, as far as how it happens, the answer is deceptively simple. Inflation is caused by too much demand relative to supply. One way this can happen is if there are supply shocks. For example, an oil shortage caused major inflation in the 70s, and a shortage of consumer goods contributed to the post-pandemic inflation. This type of supply shortage is referred to by economists as cost pull inflation. A major increase in the money supply can also cause inflation. This happens when too much money chases too few goods, and as a result, prices get bid up. This is referred to as demand pull inflation, and is exactly what added to our pandemic problems when government stimulus payments put a lot of spare cash in people's pockets. Adding to the problem was the government printing lots of money for those payments, and as a result, inflation was all but guaranteed. Finally, it's worth noting that expectations can also drive inflation. How much inflation people expect can affect how much inflation we actually get, as businesses often raise prices in anticipation of future changes in economic outlook. So how do you bring inflation under control? Or, for that matter, push us out of deflation and recession? Well, you probably already know the answer to that, as it's all over the news all the time, and that is interest rates. The Fed is in charge of dealing with inflation, and their main tool is to raise or lower interest rates. High rates will put a damper on a too hot economy where inflation is running wild, and lowering rates will have the opposite effect, with inflation decreasing as a result. Okay, that was a quick crash course in inflation and deflation. As always, if you enjoy this content, please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video.